North and on the proposed Yonge Street North subway extension. One day, we hope in the not-too-distant future, the relief line will be running right through this spot. How far into the future depends entirely on whether the province commits to funding its fair share of Toronto's next phase of priority transit projects, the priority transit projects that have been approved by the City Council at the request of the federal government so they could determine where their funding was going to go, the funding which was announced in the budget, the federal budget of this year. Toronto City Council, through that vote and through that list, has made it very clear that the relief line is one of those priority projects. Transit riders need this line to be up and running by 2031 or earlier, or else the system will be at a critical overcapacity. The federal government has made it clear that it is ready to fund future transit projects. They were the ones who asked us for the priority project list so that it could be a council-approved list. The 2017 budget, federal budget, promises billions of dollars for transit infrastructure, and these future priority projects, including the relief line, will be getting a share of that money. The province has been a good partner when it comes to building Toronto Transit in the past and at present. We wouldn't have the Eglinton Crosstown under construction today without provincial funding. They're paying for all of the cost of building that. I'm sure they will tell you shortly after this news conference that they've put $150 million towards studying the relief line. I acknowledge that, and I thank them for that. But this is about securing the provincial share of the funding to build the relief line. Not to design it and plan it. That's important. It has to be done. But you also have to know when you're designing and planning something that you have the money to build it. I'm puzzled oftentimes by the hesitation when they are investing $150 million in design and planning, why they're hesitant to say, yes, we'll be there at the table as a partner to build the relief line as soon as possible. Why would you invest $150 million in design and planning if you weren't planning to fund or be a partner in funding the building of the transit line? It's kind of like spending $50,000 on architect's drawings to do something by way of a new house, but not having any way of knowing how you're going to pay for it. It doesn't make sense. The relief line is a new subway that will connect downtown Toronto to the Bloor-Danforth subway east of the Don River. This new line will be the next major step after automatic signal control and smart track to relieve crowding on the Yonge Street subway line, especially at the Bloor-Yonge pinch point. Without a provincial contribution, and denied the ability by the same Ontario government, the ability to raise our own revenue to pay for transit, it is not realistic that the City of Toronto could carry two-thirds of the multi-billion-dollar cost of this large-scale transformative project, the relief line, using property tax revenues. Nor should it have to do that. Multi-billion-dollar projects of this kind, as we discussed yesterday with housing, are not what property taxes were intended to finance. We need a commitment from the Government of Ontario that it will be a funding partner on the building of this relief line and the other council-approved future transit projects. Before the provincial budget, I made it clear that if the Ontario government wasn't willing to offer matching transit funding, matching to the federal government for the relief line, it would be impossible for the city government to push ahead with studying the expansion of our Yonge subway line north into the York region. The budget came and went with no new commitments for future transit. Expanding the Yonge line north is important from a regional perspective. I understand that. Many York region politicians have underscored that for me. But the commute for Toronto transit riders won't get any better with a Yonge Street North subway extension. In fact, extending the Yonge subway north might make that commute worse. I firmly believe that the relief line must be funded and very well advanced before we proceed with any actual extension north of the Yonge Street subway. Next week, the city's executive committee will consider a report on the planning and design for the relief line and for the Yonge North subway extension. And as you know, it deals with matters of the alignment of the relief line, which have been under active public discussion. Though the report suggests continued work on both the relief line itself and the North Yonge extension, I may have to reconsider our continuing with work on the Yonge North extension while there is such uncertainty surrounding the relief line. My responsibility is to make overcrowding better on the Yonge subway, to eliminate overcrowding, not to make it worse. The Yonge Street North extension will only add more passengers to the Yonge Street subway, and without relief, I can't allow that to happen. When people can't get on trains today, that's not the time to be adding more passengers to those trains without also providing for relief. The report that was released this morning also makes it clear that preliminary work needs to begin on the relief line north, if I can call it that. This line would be an extension of the relief line we're talking about today, past the Bloor-Danforth line, up to Don Mills to connect with the Shepherd subway. This extension would make a significant contribution to relieving overcrowding on the Yonge subway north of Bloor. To begin work on Relief North now would produce for Council a report on Relief Line North by the beginning of 2018, and that report would include a preferred alignment and station locations. I believe it is very important we begin this preliminary work, so I will support this recommendation. I think what it shows is something that I've talked about over and over again and that I'm trying to communicate to the Government of Ontario, and that is that the work of building transit in Toronto, in part thanks to the fact we took a lot of time off, the work of building transit in Toronto must going forward be constant. Never again can we let decades go by without anything being built and without the next project and the next project after that being planned. We will build and we will build and we will build because that is what a great livable city does, and it is the only way we are really going to tackle crippling congestion that is affecting so many people in the traffic in this city. We are committed to building a transit system that will catch up to the existing demand, catch up to the growth that we've seen take place in the city, and serve future generations. To achieve that will require nothing less than a three-government partnership. A three-government partnership which the federal government has announced that it will join. We look forward to the province saying they will be there with us too on that next chapter, next very necessary chapter of future transit development in the City of Toronto. I'm now happy to, were you to say a word, or were you to, Josh? Please do.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, and thank you, Councillor Fletcher, for hosting us here in your community and the future home of the Relief Line. I'll just quickly say from a TTC perspective, the Relief Line has been a priority for years, if not decades. It's been on the books since almost the turn of the century, and we know both from a TTC planning perspective, from a city planning perspective, and from our riders' perspective, especially those who are squeezed in on the Yonge line, that this line needs to be built. And this line needs to be built soon, and I think that the report in front of Council today and that will be in front of the Commission is essential to move forward. I expect they'll be moved forward with enthusiasm and unanimously, but at the same time, as the Mayor mentioned, there is an issue of sequencing, and work must be done and advanced on the downtown Relief Line or the Relief Line before we look at extending the subway north, because so many of our passengers are barely able to get on at their own stations at Eglinton and Lawrence and beyond, and so that work has to be sequenced that way, and it's essential that if we're going to continue on the Yonge North work, that the TTC is able to advance and be funded for the work on the Relief Line. I'll also just add that the TTC has taken considerable steps to relieve congestion. What the Relief Line does is not only provide an alternative for those who are traveling on the busy Yonge line, but it relieves congestion from that pinch point at Yonge and Bloor, which is so essential. So while we have made renovations to that station, we have had new subway cars, and we're in the process of adding and implementing automatic train control that will allow trains to move faster, that will only go so far. And for us to deal with the capacity issues we'll have at 2031, the Relief Line must be built. So I commend Mayor Tory for advancing this and advocating it. I commend councillors like Councillor Fletcher for pushing and advocating for this for so many years. And I hope that my council colleagues and commission colleagues vote to advance this work and ensure that the Relief Line not just becomes something we talk about or debate or plan, but it's something that is being built. Thank you very much.
And I'll just finish by drawing your attention in the report to all the numbers that talk about future capacity issues on the Yonge Bloor subway, including at Yonge and Bloor, and also the recommendations that speak separately to moving forward with the Relief Line, moving forward with the Yonge North, which is in there because it's work that is presently being done, and also moving forward with the Relief North, as I call it, which is to start to look at that as something that we have to take a look at as just a matter of basic responsibility. Questions?
Mr. Mayor, where does the waterfront transit reset figure into all this?
The waterfront transit is one of the four. There's actually 4 priority projects on the council-approved list that went forward to the federal government to indicate to them what we would use their money to fund by way of future transit projects. Because their insistence was, and quite correctly so, that their money should go to fund future transit initiatives. And so the projects are Smart Track, the Eglinton East LRT, Waterfront, and the Relief Line.
Mr. Mayor, the province has made the point that no government has committed any money to the construction of the Relief Line, and while you're demanding for them to do it, the city hasn't put in any of its own cash. Wouldn't your argument be stronger if the city that committed billions of dollars to construction?
Ben, the only reason that the City of Toronto has not committed any money to the relief line is because the means of paying for it that we had identified and approved with an overwhelming vote of the City Council was, in my view, unfairly denied to us by the same Government of Ontario. And so I find it interesting and ironic that the minister who stands up and says, well, the City of Toronto hasn't committed itself to its money for the relief line was the very same minister who led the charge on doing away with the road tolls, which were overwhelmingly approved by the City Council in Toronto. I think that was unfair. And I'm now saying, and you've heard me say this before, I'm now saying, well, if the system worked on the basis that 905 MPPs, including Mr. Del Duca, were able to stand up and say, and put a huge amount of pressure on the government to say, well, you have to stop something the City of Toronto wants to do, then those very same people, I hope, can help me and the members of council to stand up and say, let's go ahead with something that must be done. And we will sort out our contribution. I am not saying, you've not heard me say we're not expecting to be partners at that table, but give us some time in the aftermath of us having spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of discussion approving road tolls, which would have produced more than enough money to finance our share on an ongoing basis. Give me time to figure out how we're going to deal with that going forward. We'll be there. They haven't even said they'll be there. I can tell you right now, I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of my council colleagues, we will be there for the relief line. We had a council-approved list of projects given to the federal government saying we'll be there. And so they haven't said they'll be there, and the federal government has said it will be giving money to us in the billions of dollars for our priority list that was approved by council. So that means they're there. And we're going to be there, and the province has not said anything beyond this money for planning.
Mayor Tory, but the province has said that in lieu of money to give the gas tax money. Is it your belief that gas tax money?
Oh, that the gas tax money can be used, but understand that what the gas tax money did was nowhere near make up for the cancellation of road tolls. First of all, the amount of money is less in and of itself. Secondly, the road tolls would have allowed us to borrow against that revenue stream because it's our revenue stream, and we could have borrowed lots more money, sufficiently to finance the relief line and other transit projects. So when they give us the fuel tax money, it is welcome. But the notion that they think that that's it and they can kind of wash their hands of it and that they're not going to step forward and say, yes, we'll be at the table for the relief line, yes, we'll be at the table for waterfront transit, and yes, we'll be at the table for the Eglinton East LRT, to me is worrisome and puzzling because these are the projects going forward that are needed to build the city, council approved, and where the federal government has specifically asked for that list so they can partner with us. Well, if we have to make it clear in this report, we will. I think there's no misunderstanding on the part of the Government of Ontario and certainly the York Region politicians that that is our position, that the relief line must be well advanced and funded before we can even consider an extension. And I took it one step further today and said it may well be the case that we should just, we've got lots to do at the TTC. Heavens above, they have all kinds of projects to work on. And if we're uncertain that the relief line, will be funded or not by the province, then why would we be devoting our time working on the Yonge Street North extension, because the two are very much interrelated. And so I've said that I'll consider, myself, just because I'm a member of the executive committee, I obviously have colleagues who'd have to support these things or not. I would consider motions that deal with some of these things at the meeting coming next week, depending on what we've considered in the meantime. What I said today was that I would consider not even proceeding with this work, just because, again, it's work being done by our people at the TTC largely. This is our transit line, and you'll see the report clearly sets out that any extension to the Yonge North subway, if it ever happens, will be a TTC project run and managed by the TTC because it's our subway. And so I have raised the possibility this morning that we might have to consider just diverting our resources to other work, and I've certainly said a number of times, including today, that we really can't, go too far with the Yonge Street North extension until such time as we know the relief line is going to happen, and is going to happen